Please welcome our first panel with Kurt Schork Award winners Jason Motlagh, Kenneth R. Rosen, and Raphael Soros. This session will be moderated by Christiane Amanpour, CBE.
I like those initials. Thank you so much for having me here to moderate the conversation with these wonderful journalists and the award winners of the Kurt Schork Awards. It is, as we heard from the great Dmitry Muratov, an amazingly important time to be acknowledging journalists like yourselves and to be acknowledging journalists who work in the world of independence and freedom rather than those belonging to a state or those who can easily be silenced, which doesn't mean to say that your job is any easier or any safer. It's really important to be doing this panel right now because we have seen over certainly the last year, but most definitely for a long time now, the accumulated and worryingly increasing war on journalism and on the truth. Journalists are being increasingly silenced, increasingly diverted from their missions, not just because of, autocrats and the others, but because of the environment, what we see in social media, what we see with fake news, all of that. So the Kurt Schork Awards stand for everything that is good and right about journalism. It is about seeking the truth. It is about holding those who need to be held to account accountable. And it is most especially, and these gentlemen obviously embody that, it is most especially to live up to Kurt's own ideals of living and working to the truth of what journalism is, which is being on the ground and in the field in order to witness firsthand and not to be sitting back and taking others' secondhand information and repackaging it. So being in the field is incredibly important. Certainly, yourself, Kenneth, and Jason, you've been to two places that I've been this year, which are really, really difficult, and I'm going back again, Ukraine and Afghanistan. You, Raphael, have had an incredibly difficult time trying to report the truth in an increasingly oppressive environment for free journalists in your home country of Brazil. Kurt was a very good friend of mine, a very close colleague. We covered the Balkan Wars together, most particularly the Bosnia War, which I would like to say almost set the table for what we're seeing in Ukraine today. It was an illegal war by one entity which had a political agenda. And that agenda was much like what we see in Russia right now. The illegal war by Russia in Ukraine is to carve out territory and to deny and squash people's vote and their desire for independence, democracy, freedom, human rights, and the lot. So again, really important that we're having this conversation and that we're honoring these gentlemen at this time. What I'd like to do is also say that one of the journalists who has been awarded, well, let me first briefly introduce our panel. So Kenneth Rosen, as I said, he is the 2022 Freelance Award winner, and this was for his multifaceted investigative work where he traveled to the front lines in Ukraine to shed light on the Russian cyber warfare, whilst also reporting on the control of oil resources back in Syria and the inhumane treatment of migrants in Europe. So it's a big brief. Jason Motlagh, Iranian-American, proud to say, 2021 Freelance Award winner. This was awarded for his work in the war in Afghanistan prior to the West withdrawal back in August of 21. And he took real risks to shine a light on both civilian and journalistic casualties as well as the consequences of the conflict on the Afghan people and what it means now to have an even more repressive regime in charge after 20 years of relative freedom and progress. Raphael Soros, as I mentioned, from Brazil, is the 2021 Local Reporter winner, awarded for his investigations into police conduct and violence in Brazil, which exposed a number of extrajudicial killings and a corrupt system of impunity. And of course, all this matters because Brazil is about to go to its runoff this weekend. Now, as I said, the 2022 winner who couldn't be at the Trust Conference is Kyo Ye Lin. He's from Myanmar. And he couldn't come because he is now in the United States. He's been granted asylum because it's simply too difficult and too risky for him to keep living in his home country of Myanmar. Soldiers arrested him. They tried to, for his work, which he was trying to expose the irregularities and the oppression committed by the Myanmar junta after their February coup. But we're going to hear from him now briefly, his acceptance remarks for this wonderful award.
I was extremely honored to be winner of the Kurt Schork Award because it is a kind of recognition of the work done by the local journalists and news officers who are barely credited for their effort. Fishing is something interesting and challenging to me. It needs experience, knowledge, network, and of course a lot of coordination. We, the fisher, required to dig deeper and deeper and sometimes putting ourselves in a dangerous situation. All the story I have my colleagues were exposing how the military region is using the systematic and brutal method in crushing the opponent and harm the civilian. For some story, I spent overnight talking to the member of the underground guerrilla group in Yangon, trying to understand why they are risking their life. At many points, I found myself stuck in the dangerous condition. Although I was named for the prize, I consider it is dedicated to all Burmese journalists who are taking the great risk for simply doing their job. This prize is for you.
So Kyo makes a really important point that it's so often in many of these repressive environments, local people who take the biggest risks to report. Hence, the importance of this award is unique amongst awards for honoring fixers, local journalists, and freelancers. And it's really important to know that people like us who come from big organizations, we depend on them very heavily to be able to do our work in the field. So I'm going to have a lovely conversation. 10 minutes before the end, we will reserve for questions from the audience, and I hope that you will submit your questions. I've been told I've got an iPad. I hope I can actually manage my very Luddite abilities with technology. But the questions will be submitted through the TRF app, and they'll be collated, and I'll be able to ask some of these questions on this app too, and the questions are going, obviously, to our panelists here. So because you're sitting right next to me, and because I'm going to Ukraine next week, and you have been awarded for your reporting there. And hearing what you just heard from Dimitri, the danger for people to actually report from there, even if you're not there, even if you're in Russia on the other side. What was it like? What did you expect and what did you find when you went there?
It was total chaos, even leading up to the initial invasion, both for the people of Ukraine and also the journalists working to cover the events unfolding there. Both sides of the coin, both Russia and Ukraine, were heavily monitoring sort of what was coming out. Your access to anything and everyone was heavily guarded, and just navigating wasn't what it was like post-annexation of Crimea in 2014, when you had sort of a more fluid situation and people were more willing to let you roam around. So that sort of presents really difficult challenges for freelance journalists and local journalists who, by and large, have had that access pre-war, now have it taken back is it's challenging to bring out news and information every day.
Did you find that the Ukrainian side, so to speak, welcomed you, as opposed to what the Russian side we can see is not welcoming news?
Yeah, and I think that's a product of my Western affiliation, of course. Other journalists who are trying to cover it for perhaps more Russia-sympathetic nations would have a difficult opportunity, which is unfortunate in many respects. But no, I was welcomed by most high officials who were eager to get their story out. And in my particular story, sort of the troubles faced by the cybersecurity situation, which is we've seen now grown outside of the borders of Ukraine into and the rest of the world.
Jason, you have the Freelance Award for your work. Again, you were in Afghanistan. I think we just talked backstage, I was there around the same time this year and saw what really Taliban 2.0 was like. When you were there covering the work that got you this award. It was around the time of the fall. They call it the liberation and the victory. What was it actually like, certainly as an American, although you could pass for an Afghan because you clearly probably speak the language, right? Some of it anyway, a little bit.
Passively.
Yeah, possibly. Trying to cover, because that was complete chaos.
Yeah, yeah.
What was it like?
It was a treacherous time. And, so often our sense of security is really dictated by the people we're working with, the local journalists, the fixers. At that point, there was a systematic campaign of killing Afghan journalists. So these are eyes and ears on the ground. This is our intelligence, our ground intelligence. And so vis-a-vis them, we were all very anxious about working. It got to the point where a lot of the people that I relied on, I put my, whose life in their hands, I couldn't reasonably ask them to do certain things because it was exposing them unnecessarily, which made our work a lot more difficult. So very fraught. The main story that I submitted was about the roads. It was a big part of what we did over there. Thousands of miles built all over the country. And looking at the road as sort of a symbol of both the promise of the whole enterprise, but what went wrong. It was a huge crucible for U.S. soldiers, for Afghan civilians who were killed on these roads as these roads were targeted by the Taliban. And of course, the roads also became symbolic for the corruption and all the money that was siphoned away and how certain actors were empowered over others and how that created more animosity and ultimately undermined institutions. But just navigating those roads, very difficult. And it wasn't only the Taliban, but there were a lot of government attacks that were just getting increasingly chaotic, civilians getting killed. And so we sort of had to thread the needle just to get out into the field.
And that was before and just leading up to the fall.
That was before. So the U.S. has expressed that it's planning to withdraw, right? And so then the Taliban is taking the gloves off and really pushing the fight against the Afghan government. And so getting out, especially out of the cities into the provinces, was very difficult.
And what kind of risk? I know it's difficult to navigate. It's a big country, a lot of roads. What kind of risk did you have to balance with the reward? Were there times when you thought, well, hang on, I can't take this turn because it's just not going to be worth it?
Yeah, no, I mean, like with so many of these stories, they just kind of take their own momentum. And so you're in it now, and maybe judgment, isn't as good as it should be. But there were some times where we just had to go for it. I remember at one point, we had covered the civilian toll along these highways. People had been blown up or caught in crossfires, but we really wanted to get to an isolated Afghan army base. And the only way was to take the highway. There was no shortcut, and they wouldn't get us a helicopter at that point. And we knew we were going through bandit country. We had to go through a Taliban-controlled area, and we got there, and they wouldn't let us in initially. And so we had to double back. We're finally able to knock on the door, and we implored Afghan hospitality, so they let us in for the night. But then, coming out, they realized, okay, we're a soft target coming out of this base, and we have a long way back. And now they've got spotters seeing what's going on. So, that was the sort of thing we had to do. Luckily, we didn't have any problem. Ironically, as we were coming back into Kabul, it was the Afghan military that detained us because they didn't want us there.
Yep.
Because they were getting hammered, and they were really trying to control the reporting. Morale was really low. Resupply was non-existent. So it was a really troublesome time, and I think everyone saw the writing on the wall.
I'm going to come back to what it's like actually being a freelancer and not having a massive organization behind you. But first to you, Rafael Suarez, local reporter. Who do you actually report for in Brazil?
I report for Globo. That's one of the major companies in Brazil.
Yeah.
And this is fundamental for my work there because, well, there is a lot of judicial harassment and internet harassment, and well, in my case, I have a lot of court actions, civil and criminal actions that I only can handle this because I work in a major organization and I cover an aspect. Well, I mean, covering police in Brazil is police is a category that is that has politicized in the last years, and they are more strong to deal with journalists, and this happened to me. So because of that, I have to if I didn't work in a major company, I wouldn't do what I do nowadays.
I mean, Brazil is a democracy, and yet, as you point out, and as we've been witnessing, certainly from this last presidential term, it's very, very difficult for journalists to operate, and as you say, a lot of the arms of the state are employed against journalists. You, for instance, in one of your investigations into extrajudicial killings by the police, you were demanding and making very reasonable freedom of information requests, but they were denied for a long time, nearly a year. So what was the effect of that on your storytelling, and what drove you to keep this fairly risky work of investigating a police force that didn't want you anywhere near them?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that, well, Brazil is not more a friendly country to report. There's an example of Don Phillips. Don was an excellent reporter. He lived in Rio. I met him a lot of times, and he was killed in the Amazon forest. And to report from there using public data, it's not a easy task because, well, in Brazil we have our Freedom of Information Act is from 2011. In USA, the FOIA is exists for more than 50, 60 years. Mm-hmm. And in the States, this law is almost not regulated till today. So in Rio, like in 2016, 2017, I have to write letters to the government to make my requests. Mm-hmm. And this is like insane. It should not exist. Well, this exists nowadays. It's a little bit different, but Brazil still, and Rio is a very opaque state. So because of that, in this case, it was a case, me and the organization and the public defenders of Rio against the military justice. And it was a year, and I wanted to have information about a police operation, a military police operation in a favela in nearby Rio. And I only could get it, I requested my FOIA request in 2019, and in December 2020, I got my response.
And the military police of Rio and also the other organizations have publicly criticized and insulted your work. So you have explained that you work for a big organization, Globo, which has a lot of resources behind it and looks out for its employees such as yourself. What about you guys, Jason and Kenneth? What about when you don't have that backing? What's it like going to a war zone and you don't have a New York? Well, you might, but I mean, you don't have the big organizations behind you.
It's nerve-wracking.
You go to pitch, or do you pitch before you go?
I pitch before I go because, on a fundamental level of logistics, I can't afford it unless I have some sort of assurance that I'll get a payout. But other than that, they oftentimes are very clear about saying they don't hold any responsibility over anything that could happen to us. And a lot of organizations have signed on to a declaration that ensures that they will look after us while we're abroad, but many won't.
So if you're injured or anything happens to you, what happens if you're working for any number of these organizations?
My wife and kids have to figure it out.
That's it? No airlift, no medical treatment?
No, I used to be able to afford high-risk insurance, but that's
now you can't.
Astronomical. Yeah, I mean, the great thing about this award is that it brings not only financial support to us, but also sort of raises the awareness to stories that might otherwise fall into a void of social media or government control.
And does that make you think twice about going?
Not usually. Like you said, I mean, we can only do so much risk assessment before we go into these conflict zones, because when things go bad, they go bad quickly. Mm-hmm. A wrong turn is not a wrong turn until it is. So it doesn't stop me, because it's important to get the stories out and give voice to people who I know won't be heard otherwise, mm-hmm. even if my story does fall into a void for some while. I mean, it does their story justice, and they feel a sense of pride in knowing that people care.
And Jason, did you find that? I mean, first, the same question to you about risk assessment and what you could expect in terms of help from whoever you're writing for.
It's gotten a little bit better, I think, as time has gone on for me, and I know there are some industry standards now that are being accepted more widely, which is a positive development. But fundamentally, I know that I'm on my own. There are insurance plans that I might be able to take out that might cover Lee in the case of bodily harm, but if you're kidnapped, which is kind of the worst case scenario, that's always sort of a don't ask, don't tell scenario. Those are prohibitively expensive policies, so you just can't count on that kind of backing. You like to think you could, if push comes to shove, but I wouldn't necessarily bet on it.
And this award obviously is named for our colleague Kurt Schork, who himself was killed in an ambush along with another of our colleagues in Sierra Leone in 2000. And actually, after his death, many of our organizations looked very closely at the whole safety, and including for freelancers. So a lot of the big organizations, at least for the last several years, I need to make sure that it's still the case, treated their freelancers, our freelancers and fixers and etc., to the same degree of care in a situation of calamity, injury, and the like. So I'm sorry to hear that it's not for all of you. But like what Kenneth just said, this award gives you some kind of push. What do you think you will get from it?
I think it's a good platform to get the word out. We've come a long way. The conversation around freelance journalism is a lot more evolved around things like beyond risk assessment, your emotional well-being, digital security. I think now sort of the next frontier is really extending some of this conversation to freelancers, to local journalists who are our fixers, our support in the field, and according them the same benefits, the same security and backing in the event that something does go wrong. And I think that there is a will to get there, but I haven't seen it so much in practice as far as committing concretely to looking out for these people that we rely so much on.
It's really important because, as I said, we need more and more actual journalists to be on the ground, eyewitnessing and telling, the actual facts back to audiences. Raphael, what do you think we should know about the stakes for democracy and for freedom of information in this election? And as I said, the runoff is on Sunday.
Yeah.
And let's just remind, we've got Jair Bolsonaro, who is at best an illiberal Democrat and claims that, and has said that he probably will dispute the election result if he doesn't win outright. And we've got Lula da Silva coming back from a lot of court cases, allegations of corruption and political shenanigans. Those were vacated, and he's now able to run again, and he's on the more socialist side.
Yeah, on Thursday I'm going back to Brazil to cover the elections on Saturday and Sunday. I think this is, I worked in the last 10 years, all the elections, all presidential elections, and this is the toughest elections I've covered in Brazil. And I think the biggest problem we are facing is the violence that is related to the dispute, to the political dispute. The violence in the society and the violence against journalism. And Jair Bolsonaro, our incumbent president, he attacks journalism, he provokes journalists, and also he makes his supporters to hate our job, and this is very bad for the coverage we are having in these elections. In our first round, like in the USA, the polls are wrong. Well, most polls indicated that Lula had a chance to win in the first round, but this didn't happen. And like in the USA, Bolsonaro had many votes than the polls registered before. So it's difficult. I think it will be an election decided by 2-3 million votes. This never happened in Brazil. And well, let's see. I think this election doesn't end in this Sunday, only in January, because there will be when the next president take the power.
Again, people are concerned that it might have echoes and shadows of what happened in the United States. last time around. Kenneth, you have also shone a light on the often inhumane treatment of migrants in Europe. You were granted quite a lot of access, right, to facilities that have rarely been seen by the media. Tell us about how you got that access, because that's not obvious either. Governments don't generally want people to see these facilities,
Right, and
even in democracies.
Right, and a lot of that goes to the fixers or the news assistants that we work with on the ground, and just persistence and trying oftentimes dozens of times just to get access. And that's it takes time and energy, and I make it a point to tell people who aren't media savvy or aware of what we do that there's a lot that goes into writing a 4,000 word, 5,000 word magazine story. There's dozens of people involved. There's hundreds of hours spent. And then what you see is just the tip of a long, grueling haul to get that information out. So that access was just pure luck and pure persistence.
Mm-hmm. And as we get closer to the question and answer time, feel free to put your questions through the app, and we will put them to our panel. What do you think your investigation on the migrant issues? Do you feel that it led to anything tangible?
No, I don't. And I say that with a faint heart, because I know my job is to bring this information out in sort of a war of attrition against misinformation and disinformation, and to educate the public on a rolling basis. So I find my contribution to that discussion about an inhospitable Europe to be valuable, but there's not ever usually a direct link. Oftentimes, sometimes it goes into the void. Other news stories take precedent, and it's discouraging. But again, awards like this help us really tell the story even more to more people.
Mm-hmm. And Jason, tiny little bit of despair over here, because you want to see results, really. I mean, we are kind of a result-oriented bunch of people. We want to believe that when we shine a light, somebody is going to get some help somewhere, or it's going to make a difference. Does that motivate you, and how have you seen your work have a difference or not?
I think a lot of us probably, when we were younger, we came out the gate really hard charging, thinking that our work would change the world, and very rarely it does, but only incrementally. I tend to look at stories less as a silver bullet that's going to bring a presidency down, more as just drops in a bucket. But you have to do them, and they do add up. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's not always in real time, but years after the fact. And I think a lot of my reporting in Afghanistan, for me, it's just been important to really amplify voices that have been sort of lost in the bigger political machinations. But also just creating a record, of what went wrong, and that's something that, when the dust really settles, I think will still take some time to reflect on and pore over and come.
I really think that's such an important point. Creating a record like what we're seeing certainly now in Ukraine, when the invading forces get pushed back, the layers of evil and inhumanity and war crimes that are being unfolded, or rather revealed right now, are already going into the hopper of the international accountability process. So I'm going to turn to some questions from the members who are here. So this is for all of you, but I'm going to ask you first, Raphael. As we were saying, we exist in an era of misinformation and fake news. So how do you, A, navigate that, and B, this is called the trust confidence, make sure that what you do actually is worthy of the trust of your consumers, your readers, your watchers, etc.?
I think, well, first of all, I think that you said in the beginning is, for me, my greatest mission in my work to do this, to have more trust from my readers, is going on the ground, seeing the events and showing them. Because I think we journalists, we love documents. We love to take documents and read stories of others that tells us a story of an event. But I think it's best when we are there, when we witness the event, when we interview the people that participated, and we can tell what happened. And one of the stories that I submitted to the prize was this story. It was a police and military operation in São Gonçalo, Rio de Janeiro. It's a city near Rio. And in this operation, 7 people were killed, and no one, no police officers and no military personnel, they said they didn't shoot. They got there, and the bodies are there. And this was crazy for me. Well, in that time, nobody covered that. It was, well, a city, a poor city near Rio, undercovered by the media. And for me, I covered public security in Rio for 10 years. It was strange for me. Well, normally, police officers, they said they shot the people because they were shot too. This case was different. And I was there in the day after. And only because I was there in the day after, I could see that, yeah, there was a problem there. And I meet someone that survived the shots. I meet in a hospital of the region. And he said to me, well, there were military personnel in a jungle next to the deaths. And so I spent 1 year investigating this operation, and in the end I got the files, the FOIA files, that became the story. But I only knew that because I was there. And this was a lesson that I take with me and for all my stories.
I want to ask both of you to weigh in on this issue of misinformation, fake news, and where to find the truth. Personally, I find it's like the worst thing people can say to me is there a truth anymore? I mean, I can't even believe that people are actually still, or have got to that point. How does that affect you?
Yeah, I mean, having to explain yourself, justify yourself, journalist being an epithet, it's very strange, and I find so much of the news coverage out there nauseating myself, and I understand where a lot of people are coming from. It's just hard to know what to think. There's just so much out there.
Yep.
But I always go back to basics, to like the craft of reporting, to committing and spending the time. And I think, as narrative storytellers, it's especially important because it goes beyond hard facts. You're appealing to people's sensibility, to their emotions. You're finding other devices to breathe an issue to life, to put people in a more human light. And that, to me, is the advantage of longer form, slower cooked storytelling, whether it's writing or in film. And I think.
And do you do mostly longer form?
I do.
You do?
Yeah, now and also in film.
Yeah.
Right, because sometimes it feels like we're almost living in a post-literate world, and so much is going on to the screen now. And so if there are issues that you care about, how can you not trick but bait people to engage a little differently? So we're working on a feature film. We're just wrapping it up on the war in Afghanistan, but we're doing it through a sport. It's exotic sport of buzkashi.
Yeah,
right?
no,
it's ancient.
It,
yeah, but for us, that's a way in. It's really about the
and
experience.
it's a feature film.
It's a feature
Great.
film about this.
So with actors and things.
No, it's a documentary.
It's a feature documentary.
But it's a full-length feature
Got it,
documentary,
okay.
and it'll be out in the spring. I encourage you to go check it out.
It's a wonderful, amazing
Yeah.
thing. I've seen it there. It's incredible.
Yeah.
You being in Ukraine and in Europe right now, where we know that there is a highly sophisticated propaganda and fake news operation that really the Russians have perfected over the years. How do you, I guess, feel about the challenge of navigating and the skill of navigating the misinformation to bring your readers and your viewers and things the truth?
I think it's a matter of, like you said, the foundational blocks of reporting and making sure that everything I do is as accurate and truthful as it can be, which is 100% truthful. If there's any doubt in any sentence, it's always gone. And I think conveying that to audience members and readers that the way we go about reporting and where we are and that who we're speaking with and how we're going about speaking with it adds a lot of assurances to the readers who might not know where this information comes from or how we got it. But as far as being truthful, I always think back to my time at the New York Times, where ending up on A2, which is where the corrections were, was a total
not a good
disaster.
place to be.
No, even if a name is misspelled wrong, and small things like that, grammar mistakes or little like absent quote marks is really devastating to that trust that we're trying to build. So always being careful about.
That's really good. That's accountability. I wonder how many people know that in places like the New York Times and many other organizations, reporters are really held to account. That is...
You don't want to end up on A2.
You just don't.
No.
I know. I want to pick up on something you said, which was inter alia, looking after everything, including mental health. And there are two questions here. So the question, when war correspondents leave town, how can we ensure the emotional well-being and safety of fixers and local journalists, freelancers, etc., who help them break the stories? How can we, all of yours, but also the others who are left on the ground? And then connected to that is, how do you deal with emotions while reporting on the war? So you brought it up.
Yeah. I think editors, news organizations can take more of an interest rather than just going through the journalists, right? The local fixers or producers. They have a direct relationship with news organizations, and so they can check in. There might be services they can extend. You know, in the era of COVID, there's been a lot of remote counseling, things like that. I don't think it even has to probe that deeply. I think just acknowledgement sometimes goes a very long way. I try and keep a running conversation with all the people I work with, even if I'm not queuing up a story, just to kind of check in, see what's going on.
Really?
It goes beyond work, yeah. And of course, you know, with Afghanistan and the evacuation, you know, we have colleagues scattered all around the world. Some are in the U.S., dislocated. They're grieving, you know, deep trauma. An Afghan wouldn't necessarily say that, but you know, there's such stoicism and a familiarity with that. But I think, you know, just being cleaved from their lives, their culture, it's a whole other thing. And so, yeah, I'm regularly in contact with a lot of these people and trying to find ways to support them in their work. And I think for us journalists, you know, it's great that this is something we can talk about more freely. You know, it's not just a shot of whiskey at the bar and, you know, on to the next. Like, it really is something that is part of the discourse. I think that's healthy. It's changed a lot in the 15 years I've been working as a journalist.
It's really interesting to hear, because you are all men, and men famously don't talk as much about this kind of thing as women tend to do. And yet, as you say, over the last several years, the space has opened in every profession. I mean, it's not just our profession, but we hear, particularly after COVID, how much mental health of all employees and anybody in the world is a really major thing. I mean, I'm just going to ask you, Rafael, Latin America is a very patriarchal, macho, you know, culture. Do you find it easy? First of all, do you acknowledge that there is a sort of a PTSD sometimes? There are emotional pressures. And do you find it comfortable and possible to talk to your employers or your colleagues?
Yep. The last time, well, in the last 2 years, I've worked as a special reporter for Globo, so I do my own stories, and the main reason for that is that because I doesn't want to go to graveyards anymore. I usually frequented graveyards like once a week. It was terrible for me, for my family. I doesn't want that anymore for me. And I talked to them, and well, they offered me the job. I wanted to stay in Rio. I was offered the job in Brasilia to cover politics. I didn't want to, and this is one of the reasons that the prize, the award was great to me, because it was it shined a light on the work done by local reporters, and this is what I like to do. I like to go to the peripheral communities and integrate with these people and tell these stories. I didn't want to go out, to move out to work in the great stories of the country, because I don't believe in that there is such a thing of small and big stories. I think that the small stories are big too. And because of that, my editor said to me, well, you can work on your stories, and that was my salvation.
That's great. That's really great. Have you ever reached a level where you feel you just don't want to go to the burial grounds and the hospitals anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially now with and I always mention my young children at home. I mean, I see their faces everywhere I go. And I thank whatever belief system I have, that they're not suffering through what all these other people are suffering through. But to put a cap on what Jason said too, is if there was an option for me to extend whatever resources that the news organization that I work for has to the freelance journalists, to the local journalists or the fixers or people who we rely on, I would choose that over getting it for myself. I mean, because we do just parachute in sometimes and end up leaving the situation and back home within a few hours. So if there was some mechanism that could care for them long after we're gone, I think that would be preferable to just our 2-week, 3-week, 1-month stint.
The flip side of this question, but you can answer this question too if you like, what gives you the greatest sense of achievement during an investigation or time in the field, even in in the most dangerous places? Where do you get your achievement? Is it the outcome? Is it the doing of?
I think it's rarely the outcome. You can probably relate to this. You're working for weeks and months on an investigation, and blood, sweat, and tears, and it just comes out, and it's just a little thud.
One tweet.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you see what you're competing with out there.
It's a Kurt Schork Award.
And so that's very humbling. I got over that a long time ago. It's nice to get a shout from your parents. But no, I think it's seeing something through, like setting a high bar. For me, I always more and more like looking for projects that scare me a little bit, that seem a little beyond the pale, where I don't have to phone it in, and that's sort of my barometer. Like that's something I need to be doing, and then marshaling the resources and pulling it off, and just the synergy between all the different people that come together to realize something like this. It's we sit up here and you get some accolades as an individual, but it's like it's a symphony. It's all coordinated, and there's so many pieces that go into it. And I think about a lot of our reporting and commitment to getting the facts right, like the magazine stories that we work with. I mean, fact checkers, as hard as it is to hear from them, they save us from ourselves.
Yeah.
And just making sure everything is buttoned up, and it's just such a process, and just feeling fortunate to still be able to do that kind of work.
And just to point out, I mean, there's a huge story going on right now in Iran that none of us can get to because they're banning foreign journalists from Iran. So the incredible efforts of people from the outside, getting the stories from inside, piecing them together, putting them out, is quite remarkable. And also to say that you and I have both been at the coalface in Afghanistan, where as hard as it is for all of us, we were there watching the women and the men of, in my case, Tolo News, when the edict came down from the Taliban. That very day I was there. You can't go on unless you wear, the face mask. And yet those women there, and the men who did it in solidarity, are determined to keep doing their profession. And that I find really inspiring, and we should really applaud all those people who are taking serious risks. We've got 2 minutes left. I heard in the green room you're working on a climate stories.
Right, out of northern Norway, yeah.
Yeah. What aspect of it are you looking at?
I was assigned a story by Politico magazine to look into climate change's impact on national security.
Mm-hmm.
Climate change is obviously opening up the Arctic in many different
Yep.
ways, and with 15,000 miles of Arctic shoreline for Russia, it's a concerning issue. And so they've been ramping up militarization of their fishing vessels and nuclear testing out in the Arctic. And it's posed a really interesting question not only for NATO, but also for the states who have collectively, the United States has collectively one icebreaker to deal with its own shoreline in Alaska and protect ships out in that region. So I think as the war in Ukraine continues to grind into winter, we're going to see a lot more activity in the Arctic. Wow. And as everything starts heating up, both in the war and in the climate, it's going to be a new front line of...
You said for Politico?
Yeah.
When can we read it?
Next month.
Next month, okay.
I just have to leave here and go write the rest of it.
All right. You said, Jason, that you're working on that feature documentary. Any other projects that we should know about?
We just got out the door. Huge relief. No, next project is going to be going back to Burma, to northern Burma. I'm hearing that it's as violent there as it's been since World War II.
Wow.
But just very little coverage. It's very difficult.
Very difficult, as we've seen from fellow winner. Yeah.
Case in point. Just getting in, threading the needle to get access. Mm-hmm. But I'm looking at 3 to 4 weeks in the backcountry. They're looking at the war against the ethnic groups.
And anything we need to know about and watch out from you?
In this year, I'm working in stories about Bolsonaro's guns politics and how criminal organizations take
Yep.
benefit of it. These stories I published this month, I think next Saturday, the last one goes out about the paramilitary groups in Rio, the militias, and I'm working on a book about military police in Rio. That's the result of my work in the last 10 years.
Well, we'll look out for that, and of course, the results of the election we'll know Sunday night or Monday. Rafael Suarez, Jason Mortlag, Kenneth Rosen, and of course, Kia Le Witten. Congratulations to all of you for being such wonderful winners.